Hello and welcome to LSAT Logic Applied. I'm your host, Andrew Leahy, an assistant teaching professor of law at Drexel Klein School of Law. This is a short format podcast where I take the tools from LSAT logical reasoning, assumptions, flaws, causation, strength, and weaken, and apply them to real-world claims in the news, science, and public discourse. For those that don't know, the LSAT is the law school admission test, a standardized exam designed to assess logical reasoning, analytical thinking, and reading comprehension for law school applicants. It's a high-stakes test with unique focus on how arguments work and how they fall apart. The LSAT is owned and administered by the Law School Admission Council, or LSAC. I don't claim any affiliation or ownership. I'm just here to teach the logic. And you don't need to be studying for the LSAT to follow along. The point is to learn how to spot weak or incomplete reasoning in everyday life, the same kind of reasoning the LSAT trains you to attack under time pressure. Today's episode looks at perceived wealth versus felt wealth, and why millionaires in 2026 may not feel so rich. Here's the background. A Washington Post story reports that there are now more American millionaires than ever before, with average household net worth in the United States exceeding $1 million and roughly 1 in 6 families crossing that 7-figure threshold. But the story's central point is that many of these people do not actually feel rich. They may feel stable, secure, or comfortable, but they do not feel wealthy in the old sense of the term. Why not? Because a lot of that wealth is tied up in assets like retirement accounts and home equity, not cash. Because housing costs have soared, because inflation has eroded the real value of $1 million, and because in many places $1 million no longer buys what people assume it should. So the implicit argument looks something like this. More Americans are millionaires, but many millionaires still feel middle class. Therefore, being a millionaire no longer means what people think it means. Or more sharply, $1 million used to signify wealth. $1 million today often does not produce the lifestyle associated with wealth. Therefore, millionaire status is no longer a reliable marker of being rich. So let's break down the claim. The structure of the argument looks something like this. A label, millionaire, historically implied a high level of wealth. Current economic conditions have changed what $1 million can buy or support. Many people with $1 million in net worth do not experience a lavish or especially elite lifestyle. Therefore, the label no longer carries the same substantive meaning it once did. That's the core move, and once again, as with past episodes, it's not obviously wrong. The article gives several reasons to take that argument seriously. Inflation has dramatically reduced the purchasing power of $1 million. More wealth is locked up in retirement vehicles and housing. High home prices and higher borrowing costs make ordinary life much more expensive, and average wealth figures can be misleading because they are pulled up by the ultra-rich. That's just how averages work. So there is something real here, but once you start unpacking the reasoning, you could see several places where the argument becomes more slippery than it might first appear. First up, we have parallel reasoning. Let's start with what the argument gets right. This is a recognizable and often valid form of reasoning, and it goes like this. A category used to imply one practical reality. Conditions have changed, and now the category no longer reliably tracks that same reality. Therefore, we should be cautious about relying on the category in the old way. Abstractly, that makes perfect sense. On the LSAT, this is similar to challenging an outdated premise or showing that a once reliable indicator no longer functions the same way under new conditions. If inflation changes purchasing power, if asset composition changes what counts as wealth, and if the cost structure of ordinary life rises, then it is reasonable to question whether the term millionaire still means what it used to mean. So the basic reasoning method is sound. But here's where the argument gets more vulnerable. It moves from being a millionaire does not feel as rich as it used to something closer to being a millionaire is not really rich at all. That is a bigger leap. Here's the abstract structure of that flaw. A category no longer guarantees the extreme version of a condition. Therefore, the category no longer meaningfully reflects that condition at all. That does not necessarily follow. Even if $1 million no longer signals extraordinary wealth, it might still signal substantial wealth relative to most households. In other words, the argument risks treating not ultra-rich as equivalent to not rich. On the LSAT, that's often a false dichotomy or an equivocation problem. The term rich is doing a lot of work without being clearly defined. And we have some equivocation on rich. This is probably the biggest logical issue in the whole story. What does rich even mean? Does it mean being in the top slice of wealth distribution? Having abundant liquid cash? Being able to retire early? Being insulated from ordinary financial stress? Or living some visibly luxurious lifestyle? Those are not the same thing. The article moves between them somewhat loosely. A person can be rich in terms of net worth and still not feel rich in terms of cash flow or lifestyle. A person can be wealthy on paper and still feel economically constrained in a high-cost area. So one LSAT-style question would be, are we using the same definition of rich throughout the argument? If not, then the conclusion may be less solid than it sounds. There's also a strong relative versus absolute issue here. The article presents evidence that $1 million buys less than it used to. That is an argument about real value over time. Fair enough. But the emotional conclusion, they don't feel rich, is often relative not just to inflation, but to surrounding social expectations. A millionaire in Los Angeles or Seattle may compare herself not to the median household, but to homeowners around her, to peers in tech, to older cultural ideas of luxury. So the article may be mixing two different claims. First, that $1 million has less real purchasing power than before. Second, that people judge wealth comparatively against the lifestyles around them. Those can both be true, but they are different explanations. On the LSAT, that is an alternative explanation issue. The feeling of not being rich may be caused not only by inflation and asset composition, but also by shifting social baselines. There is also a nice statistics move here. The story says average household net worth in the United States is now over $1 million. But it also notes that wealth is heavily concentrated at the top and that the bottom half of households hold only a tiny share of total wealth. So if someone casually hears average net worth is over $1 million, they might infer that millionaire status is common in a way that suggests broad prosperity. But averages can mislead when distributions are highly skewed. On the LSAT, this is a classic warning sign. A numerical claim may be technically true but rhetorically misleading if it obscures distribution. A better question is not just what's the average, but what does that average conceal? And there is also a subtle scope shift. The evidence shows something like this. Many people with $1 million in net worth do not feel especially wealthy in today's economy. The broader conclusion risks becoming $1 million is no longer meaningfully a sign of wealth in America. That goes further. Why? Because some of the evidence is subjective, what people feel, and some is structural, what their assets and costs actually look like. But a conclusion about the national meaning of wealth is much broader than a set of interviews plus some random macroeconomic data. On the LSAT, this is the move from a narrower showing to a broader social conclusion. To strengthen the argument, we would want to know whether millionaires today, despite not feeling rich, still enjoy materially greater financial security than the vast majority of households. Whether the key issue is really inflation or instead the fact that net worth is often illiquid and tied up in housing and retirement accounts, and whether the term rich is being used in a consistent and defensible way throughout the argument. On the other hand, the argument would be weakened if most millionaire households still rank comfortably near the top of the wealth distribution and enjoy forms of security unavailable to most Americans. The not rich conclusion turns out to rely mostly on subjective comparison rather than any meaningful lack of wealth, or the article is really describing a narrower point, that millionaire status no longer implies extravagance, rather than the broader point that it no longer implies wealth. In other words, the issue is not whether $1 million means less than it used to. It clearly does. The issue is whether that fact supports the stronger conclusion that millionaire status no longer marks out the rich. This episode obviously isn't really about millionaires. It's about how categories drift and how arguments can become unstable when the words inside them stop doing consistent work. On the LSAT, some of the hardest questions come from terms that feel obvious until you press on them. Words like rich, necessary, fair, cause, or effective. Here, the reasoning starts from a plausible observation. $1 million just don't go as far as it used to, but then it risks sliding into a broader and less precise claim that being a millionaire no longer means being rich. The key questions are, what definition of rich are we using? Are we confusing subjective feeling with objective position? And does the conclusion match the scope of the evidence at hand? Because sometimes the flaw in an argument is not in the facts at all, it's in the category. And with that, I thank you for listening to LSAT Logic Applied. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more short episodes where we apply clean logic to messy, real-world claims. See you next time.